The Blackmagic PYXIS seems to be a camera that people either love or hate. But why does this sub $3,000 full frame 6K RAW capable camera seem to ruffle so many feathers? And what's this camera really like to use? It's a camera I've been using now for about 3 or 4 months, taking it on client work, shooting short docs, shooting a ton of YouTube content. I've shot most of the last few lens videos exclusively on the PYXIS. So this is going to be my sort of like longer term impressions and reflections after using this camera. So we're going to look at everything from image quality, dynamic range, my sort of workflow for handling the Blackmagic PYXIS footage in post. We're going to compare this camera to other cameras I own, so the RED Komodo, the LUMIX S5 IIX, and we're going to do a bit of stress testing, so going to over and underexpose the camera at different ISO levels to look at where the image falls apart and how that compares to those other cameras as well. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at like some of the things that still bother me about this camera, what I'd like to see in an updated or even pro version of this camera, and who I think is really going to benefit from a camera like this. Full disclosure, Blackmagic did send me this camera. It's a loaner, I don't get to keep it. They haven't sponsored this video, they haven't even asked me to make a video, so they're not reviewing anything before it goes out. When the PYXIS was first announced, I must admit I was a bit of a skeptic. I didn't think that this camera would really be able to compete with modern cameras, given that it, had an older sensor, it had a slower sensor readout speed, issues with rolling shutter, lack of internal NDs for a cinema camera, questionable low light performance, lack of other modern mod cons like IBIS, autofocus. And I kind of thought that a lot of those compromises would put people off and just make this a bit of a, dead on arrival camera. I've got to admit, after using this camera for the last few months, that I was wrong. I really love the image that I can pull off this camera. As a Komodo shooter, I genuinely thought that the rolling shutter and slower sensor readout speed would bother me more than it actually has. And sure, yes, it's there, and yes, I do notice it, but because the overall shooting experience and image quality, the skin tones, the organic nature of the image, the highlight roll-off is so nice, it's something that I found myself overlooking and not really being that bothered about over the period of shooting with this camera. And I've also found, like in 90% of the stuff that I'm shooting, it's just not really cropped up or been an issue. The image quality from this camera is, in my opinion, superior to that on my LUMIX cameras. It just looks a lot more, filmic or organic. It doesn't suffer from that kind of like video-ness that the LUMIX cameras does. It has an optical low pass filter in it, which I think helps smooth the image out. And for me, it also has pretty decent frame rate options, up to 48 frames per second in 6K DCI and up to 46 frames per second in 6K 16:9. Is in pretty strong competition with my Komodo. It's not quite there, but for the price differential, it's really impressive. So when people ask me which is better, the Komodo or the PYXIS, it's not an easy distinction to make between these two cameras. Colours just come out looking very natural, organic. Skin tones really stand out, and I really like the way that the camera renders skin tones. And I find the only sort of adjustments I'm really doing are sort of more creative ones. So adjusting contrast and saturation, and adjusting saturation of skin tones, and then applying a creative look. I don't find like I have to really manipulate or push and pull the footage around too much to get it where I want it. And in real world scenarios, when I've been out shooting, I've been really impressed with the dynamic range. Like, I haven't found that I've had to necessarily adjust the way that I shoot or expose relative to the Komodo. Yes, in more extreme cases in terms of underexposure, there is a lot more noise and fixed pattern noise, which we'll get onto in a bit. But in that sort of general, 1 to 2 stops over and under, the camera performs really well. But there are obviously a few caveats to that. So in terms of low light, this camera obviously isn't a low light beast. What do we mean by low light performance in a camera like this, in a cinema camera? And I think those expectations are going to be set generally by whichever camera you've been shooting on previously. So if you're coming from a like mirrorless setup, you know, that has a lot of internal image processing with lots of noise reduction, especially something like one of the Sony cameras that allows, you know, incredibly high ISO shooting, yeah, you're not going to be able to expose and work with this camera in the same way. You've got to adjust the way that you shoot. It's the same with the Komodo. The Komodo doesn't perform very well at very high ISOs. So this camera has a dual ISO system, which basically means there's sort of like a low ISO range and a high ISO range, and whichever one you shoot in, you're then limited to that ISO range under the RAW tab in post. So the sort of low base ISO, you know, where you get the biggest distribution dynamic range above and below middle gray is 400 ISO, and then in the higher base range it's 3200 ISO. And generally you should be shooting in 3200 if you want more range in your highlights. So if you look here, when we do an overexposure test, we get more range in the highlights when we're at that higher ISO level. So you shouldn't really be using the highest ISO level for your low light shooting. You should be doing that at the low ISOs, because that's going to give you more range in the shadows. That's going to give you a cleaner image in your shadows. But obviously if you are struggling with lights and you are in a pinch, you obviously can shoot at those higher ISOs to boost the signal. Obviously you're going to have to sort of manage the noise. If the camera was being underexposed and I was pushing it up to 3200, the noise was becoming too problematic to get anything useful out of it. But at 1250, with a bit of noise reduction and maybe it's 1 or 2 stops underexposed, you can just about get away with some noise reduction in post and get usable images. But that's the same story for my Komodo, right? I've never really felt comfortable pushing my Komodo beyond 1600 ISO. The thing that separates these two cameras is the nature of the noise, which we'll look at in a moment. The noise pattern on a Komodo is much easier to deal with noise reduction, whereas the fixed pattern noise of the PYXIS is a lot more troublesome to deal with in post. So fixed pattern noise is kind of a known issue, if you want to call it that, on this camera. And the first time it showed up, we were shooting at dusk, and I was kind of interested in sort of how far you could push the low light capability of this camera. Like, what could you get away with? What would the footage turn out like if I shot, you know, at one of these high base ISOs with, you know, available light at dusk? And what I was seeing on the monitor was this kind of weird strobing pattern that looks very similar to kind of like what you'd see when you have like a dodgy LED light on and its frequency is out of sync with the sensor frequency. So I ran around trying to turn off all the lights at the location, and then that wasn't fixing anything. And when I was pointing the camera outside, I was still seeing this noise pattern. And then the penny dropped and I realized that this was actually the sort of noise floor or fixed pattern noise of the sensor in this camera. So that was kind of surprising and a bit sort of shocking because it was quite prominent. And so seeing that and then playing around with the footage in post, I realized that you have to be really careful with underexposing this camera, especially in those higher ISOs, because this fixed pattern noise is present both in the lower base ISOs and in the higher base ISOs, and turns up between, you know, -2, -3 stops of underexposure. So just like the Komodo, your exposure strategy of this camera needs to be sort of a bit more well thought out, and you need to sort of have a strategy and think about how you're exposing it. It's not a camera which you can just rock up and shoot in any lighting conditions, because you're going to push up against that fixed pattern noise. So that generally means that you need to then be managing the lighting conditions in your environment and adding more light if you need to in order to achieve the results that you need to get. You can't just turn up and expect to sort of shoot in the dark with this camera. But having said that, you know, in this mini doc that I was shooting, I've still got very usable footage. Shooting at dusk, you can see the image here is very dark. We're using the iPad to light the talent, you know, and when the camera is a little bit underexposed, 1 to 2 stops, you can use noise reduction in post to eliminate the noise pattern, and you should get usable footage. Let's take a look at some side-by-side comparisons between the PYXIS, Komodo and LUMIX S5 2X. And whilst we do, I'm going to tell you about today's sponsor, which is Audio. All the music in this video is taken from Audio, and I've been using their fantastic music and sound effects library across my YouTube videos for the last year. It's got a huge and diverse library of tracks. What I also love is that you can also select individual stems, so it's really cool for being able to make very unique mixes of tracks in your videos. It's also got some of the industry-leading AI search tools which massively speed up the process of finding the right track for your project. So the first is Link Match AI. basically just paste in a music link from YouTube or Spotify, and then audio will do some AI wizardry and basically just match you up with a bunch of similar tracks in its library. The next one is the awesome Hands AI. It's an amazing AI assistant that uses text prompts, and you can basically describe the scene or the type of music that you're trying to find, and then audio will link you up with appropriate tracks. The best bit, if you follow the link below and use the code PROCESS70, you'll get 70% off your first year of a Pro membership. So I want to show you how the camera performs at the different base ISO levels when you push it in terms of overexposure or underexposure. So in each scenario, we're exposing for middle grey, increasing or decreasing by 1-stop increments, and then we're bringing it back to baseline in post. Here we can see the overexposure test at ISO 400. We get up to 4 stops of overexposure, and then by 5 stops we're seeing clipping in the image and losing information, which is a pretty good result, to be honest. But in the high base exposure at 3200 ISO, we get almost an extra stop of latitude. Pretty much no clipping seen at 5 stops overexposed. So as you can see here, ISO 400 on the left, ISO 3200 on the right, you get this extra stop of latitude in your highlights when shooting in the high base ISO. So if you have a scene with lots of highlights you want to protect, preference shooting in the high base ISO for that. Comparing it now to the LUMIX S5 2X in its own high base native ISO, and we can see that this caps out much lower at 3 stops, and at 4 stops were clipped, and then at 5 stops we're completely gone, nothing there. So the PYXIS is showing much greater latitude in the highlights. Look at how the Komodo compares to the PYXIS in terms of highlight performance. So the Komodo doesn't have a native ISO, so similar to the PYXIS, you choose your ISO in terms of whether you want to preference your highlight performance or low light performance. So in this case, if we're going up to 3200 ISO to test highlight latitude, we're preferencing range in the highlights. It's not quite the same lighting setup, it's a bit harsher with the Komodo, but we are still exposing for middle grey. And as we step up the single stop increments, you can see that we've got comparable highlight performance, although the Komodo tops out at a little better. I had to really open up the lens and really push the light close up to get the Komodo to clip. And we're looking at around 6.5 stops to 7 stops when the Komodo clips. So you're getting a little bit more highlight latitude at that ISO level on the Komodo compared to the PYXIS. So let's do an underexposure test now at the low base ISO, ISO 400, which is the base that you would expect to get the best low light performance in terms of detail in your shadows. 1 stop underexposed, looking absolutely fine. 2 stops underexposed, noise is creeping in, but it's barely visible. At 3 stops, we're seeing a slight color shift, slightly green. Noise is becoming more apparent, but nothing that noise reduction wouldn't sort out. It's perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable image here. And then at 4 stops, we're seeing that appearance of very faint fixed pattern noise. Again, you could probably deal with this with most noise reduction, but the strobing fixed pattern noise is quite present in some shots and will limit what you can do in post. We're going to run the same test now, but in the high base 3200, where you'd expect to get much noisier and worse low light performance. We see noise creeping in at 1 stop underexposed, but nothing you can deal with. At 2 stops, the noise is quite prominent now. We've got the fixed pattern strobing noise. Noise reduction would just about manage this, I think. 3 stops, it's looking pretty grungy, to be honest. I think you would struggle to use this. 4 stops, boy, it's a mess. This would be unsalvageable in post. Okay, let's bring the Komodo back in and have a look at how the low light performance at ISO 400 on the PYXIS compares to the same ISO on the Komodo. Okay, here we are at baseline. At 1 stop, the Komodo maybe has a fraction of noise. You really have to squint to see it, it's barely noticeable. At 2 stops, the Komodo is beginning just to look a little bit grainy, but again, nothing that you would really notice or noise reduction wouldn't clean up. Both cameras now seem to have a bit of a color shift towards green. We are now seeing some noise in the PYXIS. The Komodo noise is a bit more present. -4 now, and you can see the PYXIS is beginning to fall apart a little bit more. You've got that strobing fixed pattern noise. The Komodo is noisy, but just the quality of the noise is much easier to deal with here.
You can have a look at what both clips look like when we apply noise reduction. In terms of the Blackmagic PYXIS clip, I had to apply much more heavy noise reduction settings in order to tidy it up. That sort of fixed pattern noise strobing is really difficult to deal with and causes quite a lot of artifacting in terms of tidying up the clips with noise reduction. Because of the quality of the noise in the Komodo clip, it's just much easier and quicker and less processor intensive to tidy that clip up.
I think one of the main selling points of this camera is that it shoots 6K full frame open gate. Beyond the LUMIX cameras, there's not many other cameras on the market at this price point that can give you that. And when you pair it with the sort of like onslaught of modern affordable anamorphics, you know, it's a really nice pairing to shoot with those lenses on. My only issue is that with the 6K open gate, you're getting the worst sensor readout speed, and this was probably the only time where I really began to see issues with the rolling shutter. With sort of like slow handheld shots, it was fine, but as you can see here, when we took the remus out and we're sort of following my friend Pierluigi and got much more movement in the frame, the motion in the image just has this quite staccato feeling to it, which I personally didn't really like. Now, the camera does have a trick up its sleeve, which we looked at in my first impressions video. It has this thing called gyro stabilization, which works fantastic with spherical lenses. And as someone pointed out to me, you should be dialing in the focal length of your lens into the camera when you want to use this properly. Although I found that even if you don't do that, it still works pretty well. The gyro stabilization does reduce the effects of rolling shutter when you apply it to your footage. So that's one get out of jail free card that you can use. However, my experience of using that on anamorphic footage is that it just doesn't really gel very well. I think because anamorphic lenses are kind of quite asymmetrical in the way that they look, and the way that the gyro stabilization is going to work, it's going to crop into the frame and sort of reframe to balance out the movement. But when you've got that sort of asymmetrical image, it just creates a lot of distortion and mess, and that sort of like asymmetry in an anamorphic lens just ends up distorting too much. So that does again limit what you can achieve with anamorphic lenses on this camera. Like if you really want, you know, strong open gate performance, you're gonna have to spend a lot more at the moment on a camera. But you can just stick this camera in Super 35 mode and then you get much better sensor readout speed. And you know, when I shot with the Laowa Proteus zooms, which are Super 35 lenses, I ended up choosing to shoot that video on the PYXIS instead of the global shutter of my Komodo. And the fact that I chose the PYXIS to shoot and demonstrate those lenses over the Komodo, I hope is proof of what I'm saying. The other upside of that is that you also get increased frame rates in Super 35 mode. So if you want to shoot 50, 60 frames in anamorphic, sticking it in Super 35 mode is going to be the way to do that. Because the PYXIS is a bit of a blank slate, that does mean you need to factor in the cost of rigging this camera out to get it shoot ready. Like the camera doesn't even come with a battery. You might already have some of this stuff lying around. If so, you'll save a bit of money, but let's assume for a moment that you don't have anything. What's the kind of lowest you can spend to get this camera shoot ready? First of all, you'll need some media, some CF Express cards. I'd say budgeting around 200 to 300 quid, you know, to get the minimum you need to shoot for a day. Then you're gonna need some sort of monitor. I would probably just, at this stage, opt for the PYXIS monitor if you want the best cost-effective solution in terms of it just connecting with a single cable to the camera. You don't need to factor in extra batteries, mounts and cables and stuff. I would also probably opt for a cage as well. The one I've been using is from a small American company called XLCS. That costs around £250 to get the cage with their sort of unique rod mounting system. You're also going to need batteries. Now you can go down two routes. You go down the BP route, that's the simplest route, or what I tend to prefer is using V-mount batteries. So because this camera is so power hungry, I would probably recommend spending around £600 to get enough batteries to get you through a day. If you're getting V-mounts, you'll also need to factor in the cost of a charger, and that can be quite expensive for a V-mount solution. And then on top of all that, you're probably going to need other little bits of rigging like top handles, side handles and stuff like that. So assume maybe like another 50 quid on top of that. So on top of the list price, which might be say around £2,700, you're looking to spend around £1,500 additional just to get the camera operational and shoot ready before even factoring in stuff like lenses, audio, lights, tripods and stuff like that. So the total cost of owning this camera and using this camera is going to be closer to £4,000, £4,200, give or take the cost that you can find some of these accessories at. So do factor that into the cost when you're thinking about buying this camera. I've got a full video that goes in depth to how I like to rig this camera and how I've rigged it up for different shooting scenarios, so do check that out. So I think it whipped up quite a lot of controversy when the camera was first announced and shown off to the public. And my thoughts on the side monitor are kind of mixed. You know, if the camera is on sticks or it's up high, it's kind of in the perfect position. So if I'm interviewing someone and the camera's next to me here, I can quickly review the image, change settings, trigger record, all that sort of stuff, and have quick access to the camera. For anything else, if it's handheld or up on a shoulder, the placement of that monitor is kind of awkward, to be honest, and the sort of limited viewing angles that the display panel has on that monitor also kind of makes stuff even more difficult. On the Komodo, the top monitor has the sort of reverse issues when the camera is high up or on sticks or I'm shooting interviews. The top placement of that monitor is kind of annoying, especially given that that's how you control the camera. So it often means I have to use an iPad to operate the camera. But for handheld work and any time when the camera is sort of being cradled or shot in my hands, the top monitor is kind of perfect for that because it's really quick and easy to monitor your image, check focus, exposure, and also adjust camera settings. I've not used it, but I think if you were going to pick up a PYXIS, then I would budget for the PYXIS monitor. I think that thing just probably completes the setup and eliminates any of the issues that you might have with the side monitor. And using those two in tandem together probably just provides a really streamlined and efficient setup, given that that monitor is a touchscreen and allows full camera control.
So who do I think that this camera is for and who is it not for? Well, I think because of the price, a lot of people who have traditionally shot on mirrorless cameras are going to be considering this camera, and there are a few things they should bear in mind before they do so. So unlike mirrorless cameras, this isn't wrapped in cotton wool. It doesn't give you sort of quality of life features like autofocus or IBIS. It doesn't sort of have these crazy ISO performances that allow you to boost the signal and shoot clean footage in low light. It definitely requires you to be intentional and think about how you're going to expose your scenes, which ISOs to shoot at in terms of preferencing your highlights or shadows. It's not a light camera, it's very heavy. I personally prefer that. I prefer shooting on heavier cameras, but I do remember that step up when I went from shooting on mirrorless cameras to stuff like FS7s and FS5s. It took a while to get used to shooting on those form factor cameras and balancing them and transporting them and all that sort of stuff. The benefit of heavier cameras, even with one like this with, you know, subpar rolling shutter performance, is that weight is a benefit. It helps stabilize the camera when you're shooting with it. You get lovely smooth handheld shots, and of course you've got the gyro stabilization that you can use in post to help add an extra layer of stabilization. And I find between those two things, the weight and the stabilization, that mostly alleviates the issues and fears that I had over the rolling shutter of this camera. I think this camera is great for documentary work, although it'll depend what kind of documentary filmmaker you are. If you like to run a camera on auto and just set and forget it and sort of have it run whilst you're doing your thing, this might not be the best camera for you, you know, looking at something like an FX6 or one of the offerings from Canon. And part of my testing for this camera involved shooting documentary, and my experience with this was fantastic. We shot in quite a lot of mixed and dodgy lighting scenarios, especially low light at night, and the camera performed really well. So stay tuned, that will be appearing in the next week or two on the channel. I'd love to know what you think of it. I think anyone who shoots narrative, maybe you shoot regularly on like cameras like the Sony Venice or the Alexa Mini, you probably rent those for certain jobs and you probably can't afford the outlay or investment to purchase one of those cameras, and it's questionable in today's day and age whether that's even a sensible investment anymore. But maybe you want a camera for yourself, for personal projects, for smaller projects. I think this will be a really suitable option for many DPs who want to own a camera. If you're used to lighting your scenes and properly managing exposure and all that sort of stuff, you'll get on really well with a camera like this. If you want a camera that you can just pick up, power on and get shooting, you maybe shoot events or do a lot of run and gun or social media work, this might not be the right option. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just need to make sure you're choosing the best tool for the job. The fact that this doesn't have compressed media might be difficult if you hand footage off remotely quite a lot. With a raw workflow, especially for professional work where you're shooting on a weekly basis, the storage capacity that you need to manage this data adds up quickly. And, you know, you're going to be finding that you're going to be dropping a lot of money on 4TB SSDs. I've probably got about 6 of these now, and they just keep on coming.
There are several things that are frustrating about the PYXIS that could be addressed in a future version or a Pro updated version, even if that camera was to launch at a higher price. I think the most obvious one would be some sort of ND solution, but it doesn't really bother me. The Komodo doesn't have any ND solution either, and I'm just used to using like a matte box, a VND, or adapters with drop-in filter solutions. Having that all built into one camera does make life a lot easier. I would say maybe another mini XLR port. I think it's kind of strange that the camera only has one. Adding in maybe an HDMI port could be useful for some people, doesn't really bother me, but I think having the option of SDI and HDMI increases the range and price point of monitors that you can use. Maybe even including some sort of compressed recording format or even ProRes recording, I think could be useful for some people. And then generally, because this camera is available in 3 lens mounts, so I have the L mount, but it's also available in a PL and EF mount, maybe in a Pro version, offering some kind of like user interchangeable mount system that allows users to swap between like a really solid PL, EF and L mount. I think that could be really cool. In terms of that side monitor, I mean, it's not something that is really a game changer or deal breaker for me, but again, if they wanted to update it, maybe adding in a flip out screen, I think that would increase the price quite a lot. Like, they could just do away with that altogether and just include some basic LCD or LED screen for settings, and then just ship the camera with the EVF or the PYXIS monitor, and I think that everyone would be fine with that. And then finally, I think just releasing a purpose-built PYXIS top handle rather than reusing the Ursa one, and the same with the mounting, rigging and adapter for the EVF, just providing something that's a bit more compact and streamlined, that's purpose-built for the PYXIS, rather than maybe just repurposing an existing bit of kit to make it a little bit cleaner, a little bit more streamlined, a bit sort of tidier on the camera. But all of that stuff, all of those updates are going to come at a price, right? It's going to push the price up of the camera, and one of the biggest selling points of the PYXIS is that it is so cheap. And there have also been some incredible sales and discounts and deals going on over the last 3 months that have made this camera even more attractive. So it'll be interesting to see that if they do release a Pro version or announce anything at NAB, what's the price point going to be, and what are people going to be prepared to pay in order to, you know, fix some of these issues with the PYXIS? Would they rather have a cheaper camera and sort of live with the compromises, or are they going to be willing to spend more? So I've loved my time with the PYXIS. It's a camera I really like using, especially for my kind of work, you know, small scale, indie filmmaking, small docs. I think the camera offers a really strong package in terms of, you know, really focusing on strong image quality and then building everything out from that. Certainly not a perfect camera, it's got a few frustrating points. It's a £3,000 camera with a full frame sensor that shoots internal RAW. That's not something I ever would have thought I'd be seeing 5 or 10 years ago. You know, there is no perfect camera, and you can obsess about tech specs and never end up pulling the trigger and buying a camera, but at some point you do have to make a decision and invest in a camera. It's not my job to convince you to buy this camera. I've got no skin in the game in terms of you buying a PYXIS or another camera. All I'm doing with this video is sharing my experiences and what I think about it. Generally, I'm of the opinion that most modern cameras are capable of producing beautiful work. I'm someone over the last few years that has moved from being this tech-obsessed person to wanting to focus more on the craft of filmmaking and image making. And since doing that, I've become less bothered and interested in comparing cameras to each other, and more about developing my skills in lighting and storytelling and editing, and seeing the camera as a tool as part of that much bigger process. For me, the PYXIS is a camera that dovetails into that process and allows me to deliver strong results, as does my Komodo. I prefer using the Komodo over something like the smaller LUMIX mirrorless cameras, but in terms of comparing it to my Komodo, I'm perfectly happy shooting on a camera like the PYXIS as much as I am for the Komodo. I actually, before I bought the Komodo, was waiting for Blackmagic to release this mythical box camera, but it didn't turn up, and I needed to make a decision and buy a camera, so in the end I went down the route of buying a Komodo. If I was trying to make that decision now, and I tried the PYXIS and the Komodo, I think it would be a very difficult decision, and I don't think there's honestly a wrong decision between picking a camera like the Komodo or the PYXIS. Maybe if you put a gun to my head, I would probably edge out and choose the Komodo, but I don't think there's a huge gap between these cameras, certainly not as much as I thought when I first started using the PYXIS. Which camera is better is very subjective. It's dependent on what types of things you shoot, depends on your budget, what kind of clients you have, who you're delivering footage for, your skill in lighting and using a camera and dealing with that footage in post. Only you can know that. So if you are trying to make a decision, good luck. Don't stress about it too much. If you feel like you've made the wrong decision, you can always sell the camera a few months later. I hope you found this video useful. Obviously, like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and please just drop me a comment because I love chatting to you in the comments. But I'm Ed, and until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.